Hey everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. So today we are going to be doing an AMA on the outbreak of the war in the Pacific. Topic I think I know fairly well, considering my academic background as a mostly Canadian historian. But I've looked at this in other ways, shapes, and forms in another lifetime ago. Just before we begin, just a few things. It's been a long time since the last live stream. I apologize for that. It was around Remembrance Day, so it's been about a month. Just had some family member pass away, so things have been kind of tight time-wise. So I wish I could have done more recently, but just haven't had the chance. So thanks everyone for coming back, sticking with the channel, particularly my patrons. Thank you so much. And the YouTube channel members, you guys are great, and your support has meant so much to me in this time. So thank you so much for all of that. So yeah, again, if you would like to be a patron or a YouTube channel member, you get all kinds of benefits and things like that. So you can check that out. Everything's linked down below. Also, before we begin, just want to bring attention to something down below. 2 days ago, I found some really interesting footage of the attack on Pearl Harbor that I had never seen before. And it's linked down below. You can check that out whenever. It's so interesting. It's so familiar. I think I was saying to somebody, maybe it was Scott watching. It's so familiar, yet different in a different lot of ways, just based on what you can see, because the film quality is not great. But it was so striking to see. I had to do something with it. I couldn't just not share that in some way on the channel. So thanks everyone, and thank you, Andreas, for the condolences. I appreciate that a lot. Last month has been pretty difficult for myself, my wife, and our family. So thank you. So let's just get into it today. So I had some questions from various social media, YouTube channel, Twitter, and patrons. Again, thank you. So I'll just start with those. I kind of just screenshotted them and put them on a Word document. I didn't do anything fancy because I just didn't really feel like saving every individual one. So we'll just go with that. So the first one we got here, hold on, sorry about that. That's what I wanted. There we go. I don't know if this is a bit of a facetious question, but and thank you, Greg, for saying that. I appreciate it, and for your coming hanging out with us today. Great, appreciate it. And hi, Colin, thanks for coming on. Hope you're feeling better from the other day. So yeah, sorry. I don't know if this one's a bit facetious, but it is a good question, right? Like that's what kicks all of this off in a lot of people's minds. Right, is the attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, I use it for the thumbnail. I get the power of the images. I studied Pearl Harbor and its impact on Hawaii and generally for my MA. So I get all of that. But what I wanted to bring up with this is it's not just Pearl Harbor, obviously. You know, the attack that begins on the 8th on Japanese time is not just Pearl Harbor. You have attacks in what is British Malaya, Hong Kong, and moving on through after that, right, into the different areas across all the, the European colonies in East Asia. So that's kind of what I wanted to bring into, bringing to the top of the mind with that is it's not just Pearl Harbor, right? These things are going on. And actually, technically, the landing in Malaya is first. It happens before Pearl Harbor. Again, it's a bit weird with the international date line and all of that. So there's a lot going on there. So obviously, the attack on Pearl Harbor is done for a reason. It's to try and cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so they can't interfere with the Japanese Southern offensive. It's that simple, really. They needed to rely on, maritime transport to make these advances happen, right? The only ones that they could affect were the ones on Hong Kong because they had surrounded Hong Kong for, years at that point. So they could attack from the land there. But the other ones, they need landings to make it fast and quick is what this offensive was based off of. The Southern Offensive, as I'll probably just keep calling it. So that's an important part of this. They weren't so worried about the British fleet as much because there wasn't a British fleet in the size of, say, that's going on in Europe or in the Mediterranean at the time. They knew that. Japanese intelligence was excellent. So that's what's going on here. It's a striking blow. They had done that at Port Arthur in 1904. Same idea, same sort of thing. Hit first and then attack. So that's what's going on here as well. So again, I think that was a bit of a facetious question, but it leads me to think of things as these ones always do, of what else is going on. It's not just Pearl Harbor, and as Scott says here, Guam is hit, Wake Island, a whole bunch of others. So again, if you have any questions, fire away, and I'm going to work through my ones that are here on this list. But if you have questions, I'll just take them in sequence, and I'll hang out as long as you guys want. I don't have anywhere to go. The wife's away for the weekend. Just me. So I'll hang out with you guys as long as you guys want. So the next one, it led to a very short exchange on Twitter, but I think was quite respectful, and again got me thinking, as these things always do. Is so Gary Pittman asks, "Did the U.S. economic sanctions make a likely war into an inevitable war?" And Brian here jumped in with how exactly I was thinking about this exact question: is did Japan's unwillingness to contain and reverse its unprovoked and brutal aggression against China make the likely expansion of their ongoing war into an inevitable expansion of their ongoing war? So again, that was the first thing that popped into my head was China, right? The Japanese brought this upon themselves. It's not often presented that way. People have all kinds of biases and agendas when they're doing these kinds of things. So they present it as, kind of somehow U.S. brought this on themselves, right? The sanctions against Japan brought about Pearl Harbor and forcing, the United States into the war in the Pacific, which of course leads to the war in Europe. I just don't see it that way. This is, again, a war that Japan starts in China. It's been going on since, well, you can say 1931, right, with the taking of Manchuria. Again, Japanese forces have been kind of in that area for a long time, have been in Korea even longer. So they're in the area, right? That's why the expansion starts in Manchuria. And then you have things like the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, which kind of leads to that next sort of phase of warfare. So, and then the brutal conflict that is China, the second Japanese, Sino-Japanese War, I believe is the official title in the West. It's really interesting way of thinking about this. That's the U.S.'s fault somehow. It's not in that sense. I don't think the United States, has a view on how its role was in the world at this time, and that plays a kind of part in this. Not in the sense that blaming FDR or the State Department or the military or whoever, maybe the bugbear of the moment or someone's argument. But the United States, kind of had vested interest in China. Roosevelt had family connections to China. That's where his family they had money and then they kind of lost it. But it would come through China. So he had this sort of interest in it. There's always been this strong U.S. interest in China throughout the late 19th century into the 20th. And then, of course, the loss of China in 1949, which makes no sense because it wasn't the United States to begin with. So you can't really talk about that as a loss. But that plays a part in this, right? That the U.S. steps up in that sense, wants to protect China from Japan as best it can without open warfare. And that's what kind of starts off this whole series of events, right? People have looked at the war with Japan as kind of going back even longer. I don't think that's a fair way of looking about it. But it's definitely part of this, right? It's two cultures clashing, different ideas, different systems, different thoughts coming together in kind of this really brutal war that takes place between the United States and Japan. But again, it's obviously connected to the brutal war in China. And Paul and Woody from World War II TV did a great stuff on that a while back. So check those out about China as well. 1 second. I'm just going to keep powering through. Okay, I want to wait for that a little bit. Okay, so what do we got here? Oh, yeah, Scott sent me something interesting the other day. That Nimitz, who takes over eventually in the central thrust in the Central Pacific of the American offensive in the Pacific, saying it was better that in the very, how do I say this? What's the word I'm looking for? Not in that Pearl Harbor was a good thing, but if the U.S. fleet had gone out and engaged the carrier force in the open ocean, it may have ended much worse than Pearl Harbor. Why that's said is because Nimitz believes they are slower, right? That was his main argument in the thing Scott sent me. They're slower. They're going to get, basically pummeled before they even get close to these Japanese carriers. And they wouldn't be able to recover these battleships, right? Most of them are recovered at Pearl Harbor, the smaller ships. That footage from Pearl Harbor has the USS Shaw explodes. That's that explosion that you see in every photo. It's not the Arizona. As far as I know, there is no photos of the Arizona exploding. There may be. Now I say it out loud. I don't think there's any film footage of the Arizona going off. That's the Shaw. They rebuilt the Shaw because, Pearl Harbor is one of the best natural harbors on the planet. And it's shallow waters, relatively speaking. It's a great way to get these ships back up, right? And some of these battleships are, shelling Normandy. not that much longer later, right? Because all things considered. Now, if they had gone to engage the Pacific Fleet, you're not getting those ships back, right? So that's a really interesting thing. See if I find it later, and I can link it and maybe share it on Twitter again afterwards. Scott, you might just have to remind me because that's really interesting. Scott always sending me good stuff. I get a backlog from Scott. There's just so much good stuff. I can't keep it up all the time. So hopefully I can get to it later on today or maybe tomorrow. On the weekend of working ahead for me. This is an interesting question. Sorry, excuse me. I had coffee earlier and it's doing a number on me. Sorry, hold on here. I'll get rid of the background. There we go. So from Andreas again, thanks for hanging out. Appreciate it. Probably getting late for you. Okay, so sorry, thinking about a radar station, would it make a difference if they had trained personnel there and discovered the attack earlier? I don't think so. Maybe a little bit. At the time, 1941, particularly the U.S. military anti-aircraft defenses aren't the greatest. They could have been ready and waiting. Maybe they could have had some of those planes up in the air and caused a little bit more damage. I don't know. Again, that's a very speculative question. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, once eventually all those AA guns got up on all those ships and everything, it made a difference. So possibly, again, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just seeing, Scott, there is footage of the Arizona exploding. Okay, we'll have to check that out. Interesting. Yeah, so I don't know. Like, again, it's a very speculative one. They could have put up a huge barrage against these planes. A lot of those high-level bombers, though, are what did the damage at the beginning because they didn't know they were coming. So again, it's a really tough one, but I don't know. I want to say yeah, I guess. But again, that's that high-level bombing that does the damage right to the Arizona. So it's hard to say. It's a difficult one for me to really have sort of a definitive answer, but I think yes, because how could it not? You know, definitely would have been better than what happened, right? With all the ammunition locked up on a Sunday morning, like that was hugely problematic. So I'm just reading through here. Okay, from Ben. My grandfather, who was Dutch and worked for Shell. Okay, yeah, that would make sense. Said he met an American Special Forces who said they were sneaking onto Japanese islands in the 30s to slit throats and do recon. Any truth to this? You mean U.S. forces doing this? No. Not even. What? Sorry, I'm just confused. I've never heard that before. In the 30s? I've been waiting a long time. No. I don't see why they would. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe they thought their war was coming. The reverse, though, Japanese getting intelligence agents into, say, Hawaii, Hong Kong, other places, I know those for sure. That definitely did happen. But the United States doing such a thing, I don't know. There was garrisons in China for quite a while, and they didn't pull out until much later. But not the same, kind of sneaking into the home islands or whatever. Maybe I don't know. I'm sorry, I've never heard that. That's a really interesting one. Well, that's really interesting, Andreas. Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, there was always going to be a scapegoat for Pearl Harbor. And that's what happened with Kimmel, right? They blamed him and Short from the U.S. Army. Probably. I mean, yeah, obviously you got to blame somebody for something like that. You can't just let that go unanswered. So yeah, you're probably right. Oh, it's only 9:40. I don't know. I'm losing track of time. Oh, and anyway, sorry, going back to the Arizona. Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know there was film footage. Just the top of my head, maybe it's not the Arizona, it's the Shaw. Because I think the Arizona explosion would be just utterly massive to do what it did. Anyway, we'll have to see what you got, Scott. That's really cool, though. Okay, so back to our list of older questions from before. Who do we got going here? So this one's a really interesting one. And this is, back to the Canada focus of my more recent academic adventures. At what point any discussions about Canada taking a more active role in the Pacific than they did? Like, I assume this means Lend-Lease agreement for the Pacific Fleet, mobilizing submarines for the South Pacific, etc. kind of, but not like this. It's really interesting that it's phrased that way. Just real quick, there wasn't much of a Pacific fleet to mobilize. There wasn't much to give up. Most of the war was focused in the Atlantic, so there wasn't much to give until much later. Right, with you have the Uganda and that whole mutiny. I use the air quotes, the mutiny of that happens later when they vote themselves out of the war. Maybe we can talk about that after. So that's it. There are no Canadian Marines. They don't exist. There never has been Canadian Marines. The Royal Canadian Navy has its own capabilities, particularly more recently, but they're not Marines in that sense, not like the United States. So, of course, Hong Kong is the big one, and we're going to get to that a bit. The ward and the captain. Sorry, I keep getting distracted. Sorry. Focus, Brad. Focus. So, yes, Hong Kong is obviously the big one. That starts before the war. We're going to talk about Hong Kong more because that's what I do. You have the Aleutians, right, with Kiska. That's about as big as it was going to get after Hong Kong. That's a battle that never happens. I had Ivan on, I don't even know how long ago now, talking about Kiska and the Aleutians, things like that. So that was just kind of a brigade group, but it was never going to be anything bigger than that. And that was technically North America. So that was okay politically, domestically. So, yeah, so that's really about it for that. And then, of course, you have, once the war in Europe is over, raising a division to go fight in the invasion of Japan, the main islands, or the home islands of Japan. But of course, that doesn't end up happening, so they don't go fight. I mean, there's not advisors. There's some Canadians over there, but I mean, literally like a handful, just to learn about jungle warfare, to come back to Canada and train those who are going to go fight against the Japanese. Not necessarily jungle warfare, but to learn how to fight against the Japanese and the conditions and how they fought. But of course, that doesn't end up happening. Domestically, it wasn't going to be popular, so King, of course, wanted to avoid that. I mean, Hong Kong was a debacle, so people were upset. There was a whole inquiry about that. I think I've talked about that. I did a Hong Kong AMA last year. So that wasn't going to happen. This isn't technically the Pacific, but there was a request fairly recent after Hong Kong for another Canadian battalion, at least, to go to the Falklands. The Canadian government said no because of Hong Kong. They said no, which is really, really interesting, because that was what I originally wanted to do my kind of dissertation on, and understand what does Hong Kong have to do with Canada's war effort generally, right? What impacts does that have on government thinking and military thinking and everything? It doesn't quite happen. It didn't quite happen just because of all kinds of reasons, lack of sources, that kind of thing. But I wanted to look at that, right? And that's one of the few that is directly that you can find a link. Is the rejection of the Falklands request. It's very small, but again, it was a isolated outpost of the Empire, British Empire. They didn't want to have the same sort of thing happen again. Of course, the Falklands aren't attacked like Hong Kong, but it's definitely part of this and part of all of it. I mean, it's Canada's domestic scene is quite interesting and not fully well understood by a lot of people. So that plays into this as well. And again, just the distances and logistics and everything would have made that way too hard for Canada to get involved. We don't have the base like the United States did to be able to do this. Just wasn't going to be in the cards, even if they wanted to, and there was tons of public support for it. Just probably wouldn't have happened. Yeah, there's some speculation trying to learn about the Mandate Islands. I have seen that, and all kind of the war planning and everything like that. Again, but it's just rumors. I haven't been able to kind of dig on that as much as I'd like. Kind of the Canadian stuff got in the way. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about. And again, the Amelia, I've heard this thing before. I've heard this too about Amelia Earhart. Was doing recon on the, or recce, sorry, Canadians, on the Mandate Islands, right? The Carolina Islands, Bismarck Archipelago. Probably forgetting another one. Yeah, I've heard that. I mean, there's going to be no way to prove that that I can think of. Yeah, so that's an interesting one to think about, and kind of what the U.S. was trying to do. In my understanding of kind of how Pearl Harbor went about, I don't think they had the capabilities to pull anything like that off, or the will, to be honest. And here we are. Yes, there are a lot of Canadians in the RAF squadrons in East Asia, Far East, at Singapore as well. Yeah, Canadians are everywhere. Good number of them are killed as well. They was going to send more, right? They were going to send bombers, Tiger Force as well, just like the division, the 6th Division, that didn't go overseas. Same sort of idea, but that's much later. This isn't like 42, 43 kind of thing. Thinking of all that going on. Andreas, can you tell the story of the ward and the captain? Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. What the ward and the captain are. I'm sorry, that sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm drawing a huge blank. Sorry about that. Yeah, I can't think of what that is off the top of my head. Apologize. Okay, we got more from the previous USS Ward. Okay, let's do this one first, and then see if I can get that drumming in the back of my head. Okay, interested to know from Ian from Twitter. Interested to know how much the Allies knew about the possibility of an attack and what measures were taken to inform the U.S. Not conspiracy related. A lot of conspiracy related about that, and what from what I've read, there were intercepts and clues gathered by the UK. Yes. Okay. So, yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the word thing is coming back to me now. So let's just do this one first. They knew a little bit. They didn't know that the Japanese were going to launch a carrier group, task force. Sorry. And try to hit Pearl Harbor. The possibility of Pearl Harbor being hit by a carrier group had been war gamed multiple times by the United States. They had been listening to Japanese diplomatic codes for a long time. As far as I know, they were listening to them as of Versailles, right, in 1919, or 1919. They've been listening to Japanese diplomatic codes for a long time. The United States and Britain, they shared information. Lots of information was shared. One of the books I share that, if anyone's interested to look down below after, does a great job talking about all the intelligence gathering, all the cooperation, the lack of cooperation in a lot of ways, all that good stuff. So about an attack in and of itself, no, because the Japanese did an excellent job of keeping that quiet. They maintained strict radio discipline. There was no indications. I mean, what is the famous the winds message? Winds execute or something like that. Again, can't remember the name off the top of my head. Yeah, they intercepted that, but they don't know what that means. Right? It doesn't mean anything unless you have the key to break the code. It's just they had no idea what was coming. I mean, there was always a possibility of attack. And one of the things that I want to talk about today with this, and something that really, really struck me when I was doing the research for this and looking at the actual documents themselves, we actually have them here in Canada, where I don't think they are in the UK or they're not available or something, is the intelligence that was shared, because that part was shared with Canada. The intercepts themselves were not shared, but the intelligence gathered from them in a lot of ways was. The assumption was that the Japanese were only going to attack Thailand. Around that time. They didn't think necessarily that it was even going to be December 1941. They thought it might be later. They were just trying to, get ready. And then things started to change early December with the negotiations. They knew things weren't going well, so they got prepared in the best they could. And I know more about Hong Kong than the others, obviously, for that. But in terms of, a carrier task force hitting Pearl Harbor, no. Very well done by the Japanese. Been practiced for a long time. Had been planned for a very long time. Someone asked about Yamamoto and his reputation. Maybe that's a quick sidebar here, but it's because of that that he has the reputation he does, and because he's killed early. I think that's why he has the reputation he does. Hopefully that answers James' question from Twitter. Sorry, I didn't screenshot that one. But yeah, that's what I think. He has this great reputation is because Pearl Harbor. So that's a really interesting part of that as well. So I think the Japanese just did an amazing job at this plan. and just carried out very, very well. I mean, even the Japanese were going to give a heads up indirectly. They had planned to declare war first, probably because of all things connected to, and a topic that's discussed kind of in hushed tones about all of this, and racism, right? You know, the sort of sneaky Asians attacking the white people kind of thing. That's lots going on here. So they probably were trying to avoid that and kind of save face in a way. But in terms of that, there was nothing else. I mean, just they did such an amazing job at this attack that it was just unbelievable, right? And right after it initially happened, some, again, just rumors that it was the Germans who actually did it because the Japanese weren't capable of pulling it off, which of course we know is utter bull and never happened. But yeah, it's really, really interesting part of all of this. And of course, here it's full of conspiracy theories. I did another paper on that, looking at the historiography of this, because these conspiracy theories sneak their way into all kinds of things. Like they're everywhere, and they're in academic works from reputable journals and publishers and all this stuff. It's quite a plight on the academics part of all of this, and it's quite sad actually that a lot of that gets to the level that it does. And a lot of what ifs and assumptions. And again, a good chunk of it is about the intercepts. Yeah, they're intercepting, but they're encoded. So unless you know what the codes are and what these words mean, it doesn't do you any good. There's a whole theory, you know, that there was just so much that they couldn't pick through in time, right? And it also, and intelligence only lasts for so long, right? It changes very, very quickly. Okay, so yeah, the ward. Yeah, I've heard the story. I don't know it very well. I've read about it a couple of times, but that was a long time ago, like a long, long time ago. So I don't know too much about it. But yeah, they took out a U-boat, or was a submarine, Japanese submarine. I can't remember which. But yeah, there's that as well. Sorry, I don't know that story, Andreas. I wish I did. I don't know everything. I am willing to admit that, and that's one I don't know much about. Sorry about that. Yeah, and another point again from Andreas here is that, yeah, the Japanese didn't even tell the Germans and the Italians what was happening. Hitler had no idea, and he was excited when it happened, actually. It's one of those other myths about all of this, is that the Germans were going to be like, what did you do? Why'd you do that? You know, you're going to screw us over now without telling us. The Germans and the Americans had been basically, you know, in open warfare in the North Atlantic for quite some time by December 1941. So Hitler really wanted to just get it open. You know, you know, that Nazi psycho hubris thought he could win if it was an open war, which of course is just utter nonsense because that man was insane. So yeah, that's another one too. And that's why the United States enters the war in Europe, because Hitler does it. Not because the United States does it. There's discussions from Roosevelt of how they're going to do that, right? We're at war with Japan, right? That's what that declaration is on the 8th. It's just Japan. But Hitler solves that problem. Again, because he's insane, or was insane, and now he's dead. Luckily for everyone. Yeah, so again, it was very well done. Very well done operation. Racism, again, plays into this, saying that the Japanese couldn't do it. It was only the... It's crazy. Yeah, it was a mini sub. Yeah, see, it's coming back to me. Yeah, it was a mini sub outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, just outside the mouth that goes actually into the Pacific, because again, Pearl is a massive harbor. So yeah, it's just before, and yeah, there's no real indication of what's going on. And I just think it's such a short timeline, right, between when that happens, getting the word back in. I think they radioed in that they made contact, but nothing came of it. I mean, this all happens on a Sunday morning. That was planned as well, right? Catch them off guard, and it worked. And there was more than one sub, right, and all kinds of incidents off that. So it's really interesting. Part of that, another thing, again, just to let you know, the messages not being listened to, things going on, people ignoring them, making assumptions. It's just a whole whack of things going on, and the Japanese take opportunity. As it turns out, it didn't do them much good. But yeah. Yeah, this, everything's moving on me. Sorry, guys. Yeah, well, I mean, you think so, right? If they wanted to really help their ally. But the Soviet, my apologies, and Japanese relations had their own thing going on. They had clashed in 39 in Manchuria, and the Japanese were thoroughly defeated by the Soviets, like crushed. And these sort of border incidents in Manchuria that have different names, Kalangol, and I forget the other one. Anyway, it's a really interesting thing. If you've never heard of that one, check it out. It's really cool. Basically, an open war for a couple of days. And the Soviets crushed them. And then they reach a neutrality agreement, and that's kind of what happens there. So, yeah, you think they would, but the Japanese have lots going on. The Navy want to attack to the south, right? Get the resources from mostly the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, the oil reserves, right? Because of the U.S. embargoes, because of China, right? It just takes on this whole life of its own. Whereas the army, who has been basically clashing with the Russians for a long time, wants to take them out. And that's just not what happens. I mean, they do come to war later on, but that's not until 1945. Yeah, I mean, the rumors on the 7th, 8th, it's crazy. Like the things that just fly around at that time. It's nuts. Like the things that people thought were going to happen. Like people in LA panicked. People in Vancouver panicked. They thought they were going to get attacked. I mean, the distances alone should have been enough for people to realize that wasn't going to happen. But when hysteria takes over in a population at war already, crazy things fly around, and it's just nuts. Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy rumors. I've seen the newspapers and stuff, American, Canadian, all kinds of crazy things were going on because no one had any idea what had happened. They knew it was the Japanese, but other than that, they didn't know too much. And they thought they might do it again, which turns out they couldn't have. I mean, they had one more run left in them, and that was about it. So it's really interesting to look at that. Yeah, and then on the Sunday morning, right? Yeah, the drunk or on leave, sleeping in. Like I said earlier, like the ammunition's locked up in cabinets because it's a Sunday morning. It was really interesting time to do it, and because the Japanese had understood what a Sunday meant for the U.S. Navy and for the U.S. in general, so it was a good time to do it. Yeah, it's fascinating. So we're gonna keep on keeping on with the questions. So this was not really a question, more of a statement, but it made me think of something that had to do with Hong Kong. What like malaria had on the, in general. I know in Hong Kong, one of the units, the Royal Scots, had a large number of cases of malaria. They were the ones on the mainland defending the gin drinkers line, the main defensive line in Hong Kong. And it has been posited that impacted their performance, right? The gin drinkers line is the main pivot is taken very quickly and broken through very fast, and comes undone, leads to the retreat. Yeah, it's part of it. I mean, again, it was another Japanese stroke of tactical brilliance, I would argue, attacking how they did and when they did, and all of that. It's quite detailed on what happens there at the Shingmun Redoubt as part of the gin drinkers line. But that is one of the things that said that affected the garrison was the malarial cases. So again, is that involved in other places? I don't know. Other colonies of Europeans, I'm not really sure. Yeah, it's really interesting question, and if there is work been done on it, I mean, it would be great to hear about. I'm just not too sure. Haven't done in depth, on the malaria elsewhere, right, and other campaigns and things like that. I know it affected U.S., Marines and soldiers and things like that, but to what extent, I don't know. But it's a really interesting thing to think about. These tropical diseases have an impact on largely white European or European ancestry armies. It's really, really interesting and really cool thing to think about. And we had another one about Hong Kong. Hold on, let me find it. You're getting dizzy. Don't covered it all. It looks like. So from Susan, as through Patreon, had a question. And another thing I thought of, and I've linked an article I did on this years ago now, a long time ago, about the fifth columnists as they returned in Hong Kong, as they were called at the time. This force that nobody really knew who they were and what they were doing. They were causing all kinds of chaos during the battle. So that's what made me think of this, because Susan asked about resistance with the Chinese and other groups in Hong Kong. Yes, there was a guerrilla group operating out of Hong Kong and around Hong Kong after the colony officially falls. They did some good work. I mean, Hong Kong is kind of out of the way in terms of things going on. Yes, of course, hitting the Japanese anywhere is going to be helpful, which is really, really interesting part of that as well. I don't know that as well. I just know there was guerrilla groups operating in kind of the Canton, Hong Kong area along the river there, which did allow for hiding and moving of goods and things like that. So a lot of that going on. But why I also thought about this, it's really an interesting thing that I didn't really realize until I got into the war diaries and the reports and everything, is this fifth column force that was in Japan, or sorry, set up by the Japanese in a lot of ways, and what resistance means in this aspect, and who these people are, right? Because Hong Kong, by the time the attack comes in, had been swelled by population because of those fleeing the Japanese war on the mainland. It just swells the colony, and all these people are just coming in as refugees. The Japanese were said to sneak people in with these refugees, or pay them to, once the battle starts, cause havoc, disrupt lines of communication, be part of the actual attack. Fifth columnists are said to be part of the attack on the island once they cross from the mainland to Hong Kong Island in and of itself. Fifth columnists are said to be part of it because some of the Canadians saw them and they were wearing armbands. They weren't wearing Japanese uniforms. Again, it's dark, it's difficult. I'm sure a lot of these guys had not really met any people of any other ethnicity, so could they even tell the difference between someone who's Chinese and Japanese? I'm going to go no. But, and again, fused fighting and warfare, there was some close quarters fighting, particularly right after the landings. But the fifth columnists are kind of everywhere. And how they go about doing this, is it just opportunists who are doing it to grab stuff while the fighting's going on? Yeah, there's some of that going on. But there was a concerted effort by the Japanese to attack that, right? So, and what does resistance mean in this aspect, right? Are you resisting against the Japanese later as well, which I think is what Susan was asking. But also, people might have seen it as resisting the British by helping the Japanese. And Woody again has talked about this a ton, particularly lately, about what resistance means, what collaboration means. It's a scale, it's a sliding scale. Excuse me, it's a lot of gray, a lot of confusion. It's quite crazy to think about all of this. And another aspect of all of this that gets forgotten, and I know it gets forgotten in a lot of the other works on Hong Kong, is the role of the Chinese, underground criminal organizations, the triads. The story of that is it's shocking if you've never heard of it in terms of what was happening. It's in the article I wrote. You can read that after. It's linked for free down below. It's an open source journal, which is awesome. They were given, the triads took advantage of the situation. As the battle's ongoing, news reaches the British police, basically the Hong Kong police, that the triads are going to kill every European they can find. Take their stuff, basically. They pay them off. The government of Hong Kong pays them off not to, and says attack the Chinese people instead. And that's what happens, right? Yes, the Japanese are doing it too, but so are the triads. We're exacting revenge for whatever reasons, getting even on debts. I mean, it's extremely violent. It doesn't get talked about. What happens to the garrison obviously gets a lot of attention. But there's a lot more going on than just, the 6 battalions that are fighting and the assorted troops attached to them. There's civilians involved. Civilians are getting killed. They're killing each other. It's incredibly violent. Like I said, there's a lot of people crammed into this tiny, tiny little area running from the Japanese. So there's a lot going on. Again, it's been a long time since I wrote that article, but it's outlined in there, and what fifth columnist means in this context and all of that. So there's a lot of that going on. But again, why I want to talk about it is it connects to what the Japanese had done in terms of planning, all that stuff, getting people in, getting people organized, doing intelligence gathering. I mean, getting people to understand what to do for intelligence gathering. I mean, there's stories on the island of itself before the Japanese cross over of every artillery position being hit because they knew exactly where it was. And they're like, how do they know what's going on? Or they would catch people with lanterns or flares, marking them as the battle's ongoing. And a few of them are just outright executed in the field. Some people are brought in, and they escape later, or they disappear. Again, it's far more violent in that aspect, particularly for the civilians of what's going on in Hong Kong. I think that gets forgotten a lot of what happened in that one. I mean, it happens in other places as well. But in Hong Kong, it's not discussed. I know it's not discussed because I know that literature like the back of my own hand. Yeah, so it's a really interesting part. So again, it's my own article, but if you're interested in that kind of thing and trying to gain another perspective on the beginning of the Pacific War, I think that's definitely a way to do it because it's a British colony, but also it's got multiple players involved, and it's not just Europeans or the Americans against the Japanese. There's a whole other level here. So that's a really interesting element to all of this. Again, if you guys have questions, keep firing away. I really appreciate everyone coming out, hanging out. It's been a long time, and I enjoy doing this, obviously. So please fire away. I just want to make sure I got everything. Yeah, looks like I got it all. Yeah, so that's cool. So Colin said something here about lots of American press was pro-British, yes, and did that to try and influence popular opinion for involvement in European theater. Yes, they did. But a lot of that is on purpose from the British, also with help from the Canadians. There's an office in New York, I forget the name of it officially, that is literally that they tried to do, influence American popular opinion, get the United States involved in the war for years. And they do a fairly good job, I would argue. William Stevenson is part of it. To get American opinion to be pro-British and to pressure the government to do more, kind of propaganda at its finest. And it's huge, and they do a great job. I mean, the opinion polls are very indicative of this. It's really fascinating to look at and to understand it. It's really, really cool. Yes, there was a second attack in March. Didn't do much. Obviously, it was seaplanes; they can only do so much. But yes, they did fly over and try to hit them, but I don't think they did anything. Actually, if I'm recalling correctly, Scott, I don't think they did anything. I don't think they hit anything, if I'm remembering correctly. The deprivation of those refugees is awful. Like, they suffered a lot. The British tried sort of to help them as best as possible, built camps and things like that, and those were what was used to house the garrison as POWs, which is interesting. It was just so many people. It's just a crush of people came in, and they were turning people from the fighting. Right, a lot of Chinese were interned. It's an incredibly sad story of Hong Kong and those who suffered in southern China because of the fighting, and then the fighting came to them again in Hong Kong. And as far as I know, a lot of them went back because what better option do you have? A lot were killed. Numbers are unknown. It's quite an area that I know people are trying to bring attention to, talking about the war in China. Of course, current politics is obviously going to have an impact on how we view these things. It's definitely part of it, and definitely shocking in a lot of ways. I mean, some of the things I've read about what people went through, it's just it'll break your heart. And like the lifelong impacts that this has on people and generational impacts is massive. And then you make an excellent point here, Susan, too, is go back and rethink. That's another thing why I like doing these, right, is to rethink about what all this means, right? Current rhetoric with China. I mean, China's just as guilty of it as we are currently. But we have so much more in common than we do different, and and at the time they were working together, right? China was an ally, all the same as any other ally, sometimes a better ally than other allies, depending on how you look at it. But yeah, it's an interesting way, and really think about it. Yeah, lots of movies. So many anti-Nazi movies in the early parts of the war. It's crazy. I mean, yeah, clearly, it's so funny too, because Andreas, I'll get to you in a second there about the opinion polls, but clearly they were anti-German, but they didn't want to fight. You know, a lot of people didn't want to fight. You know, it's really interesting. You know, we don't like them, but we're not going to do much about it. Or more, here, take the weapons, you do it. Again, that's a generalization, but a lot of that going on. Yeah, excuse me. This is huge because it's true. Yeah, FDR relied a lot on opinion polls. The thing about FDR is he didn't write very much, so we don't know as much about him as we would like, right? Like some other leaders wrote a ton, private stuff. I mean, King. Sorry, I just need a little coffee bump here. King wrote a ton. Other leaders wrote a ton. FDR wrote hardly anything in comparison. So we don't really know what he's thinking, but we know what conversations he had with people. Opinion polls were massive. He was using them for all kinds of things. I mean, that's why he stayed in power as long as he did. He had a pretty good pulse on what was going on. That's why he got elected so many times, and how he was able to do things. And it's fascinating to read that part as well. And two, I originally just didn't really, maybe I was a naive undergrad or a new MA student, but I didn't really believe much about the opinion polls and the credence people put them on. Back then they did. People still do today, but back then, especially FDR, put a ton of credence into them, and they were fairly new, right? So it's something that he relied upon, like Andreas says here, so much. It's crazy to think about. Was U.S. Naval Doctor? Oh, sorry, from Colin. Hope you're feeling better. We'll see. Hopefully soon. If you're not feeling well, Colin. Was U.S. naval doctrine altered by Pearl Harbor, including intelligence gathering and interpretation? Well, obviously, yes. I mean, all your battleships are destroyed or sitting on the bottom of Pearl. Of course, that's going to have an impact. In terms of the naval revolution, I guess. I don't know if that's really what it's titled. There's other people out there who know way more about all things Navy than me on YouTube, especially. Sorry, I'll keep that up. Actually, the change from what is that Mahan, Alfred Thayer Mahan thinking of massive clash in the ocean and two fleets slugging it out and doing that. Those days of battleships firing at each other were gone. Americans didn't quite realize it yet. Neither did the Japanese in a lot of ways. Midway being the perfect example of what to do and how to do it. And the Americans learned well. I mean, Coral Sea again didn't go as well as the Americans wanted. Stalls the Japanese attack and outright stops it in other ways. I think that's the big one there. Again, it's not really what I know as much on, and I want to speak out of turn about something I don't know as much on. I just know high level and how it connects to the overall war. Interpretation, I think, is more or less the same, right? You have that whole debacle about who knew about Pearl and when, and who's taking credence in this intelligence gathering period, and you have a lot of the old school thinkers like King, Admiral King, who not really a Luddite, but still doesn't really believe in these newfangled thingies, where some of them did, and it really has an impact on how the offensives go about. But again, it takes time to rebuild strength and to get ready to push back, right? You have your first policy, which connects to the Great Dominions question in a second. But it's really interesting because what else can you do, right? They learned quite quickly that the battleship's role had changed. So technically, yes, that's how it's going. But in terms of intelligence gathering, right, the codes are still being broken. Magic, as it's called, and against the Japanese. Not Ultra, it's Magic. Almost sounds like a video game with all these names, right? It's really interesting that they were able to crack these codes and understand what's going on, right? The trap set at Midway is a perfect example of that. But that takes time and doing. Again, is it a doctrinal change, or I guess technically yes. But again, that's to me that doesn't really make a difference when there's actual shooting going on. How you're thinking about things, right? You got to do what you got to do with what you have, and that's what you have going for the first year in the Pacific for the Americans. Hold on your best, right? They try to establish a command with the ABC, American, British, Chinese, Dutch command that falls apart very quickly, right? It's all ad hoc. They're just kind of grasping at straws, trying their best until they get together and midway happens, right? And they limit Japanese striking ability and start to hit back. And Guadalcanal, things like that, Tarawa. And then they go from there. Of course, the island hopping campaign had been discussed previously in wargaming and things like that, and that. But again, until you get to push comes to shove, it's all theoretical. Which is another thing I've learned quite a bit with all this stuff. Is you can talk to your blue in the face and how you go about these things, but it doesn't really matter until you have to do it. So hopefully that's good. I know it's not a great answer, Colin. I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do. So, Great Dominion, thanks for joining us. Why wasn't there more naval aviation presence at major naval bases such as Singapore, Hong Kong? The aerial defense of these bases, what there was of it, was largely handled by the RAF. That is an excellent question because there was none. Not enough to spare. Saying that the RAF defended places, particularly Hong Kong, is just not even true. There was 6, 7 planes in Hong Kong, outdated, destroyed on the ground, did nothing. So yeah, that's what I mean. There's no naval presence basically in Hong Kong. There's one destroyer is left. Mortar torpedo boats are left. They actually do quite a number of damage actually to the Japanese on the land and the sea. They cause quite a damage until they are taken out of action by enemy fire. But there's just no naval presence period in Hong Kong really, other than one destroyer. So aviation was a pipe dream. Sorry, pardon the opium pun connected to Hong Kong, but it just wasn't going to happen. And the previous commander, Gresset, wanted stuff. He wanted as much much Navy and air assets he can get his hands on. Brooke Popham supported him in this, but back in Britain, they said no. Everything went to Singapore. What there was hardly was anything, right? There's that whole interwar discussion in the British Admiralty of having the 2 ocean navy, which they can't really do. And then you have the whole, Prince of Wales repulse, which happens 2-3 days after Pearl Harbor, where they're taken over from the air, right? Massive brand new battleship is destroyed. So there hardly is any assets to begin with. I just don't have them, right? Until the Americans really get that Lend-Lease pumping, and then they can do it. But by that point, obviously, for the British, it's too late. There just isn't enough. And even Singapore's not even finished when the attack starts, right? Just they aren't ready. They hemmed and hawed and money fights in Parliament and things about Singapore in the interwar period. Things just aren't finished. Things are started, stopped, started again. The rearmament is too late, and they're not really forward thinking about this. There's discussions of naval aviation, or is it going to be land-based aviation from the Japanese? How do we, counter that? And then, of course, there's a war in Europe and the need to protect the Mediterranean, which takes precedence, obviously, over the colonies in East Asia. So that's what's going on here. There's just no resources to give anyway. So even to say that the RAF, yes, there are resources and assets, but they're minor, right? Singapore, they're bigger. That's the whole part of why Singapore was so hard to defend, right? These air bases out and about on the Malay Peninsula that fall very quickly. That was going to be the same plan for Hong Kong, was to put them on the mainland and try to defend them. Probably would have gone the same way. So it's really, really, it's crazy that they thought any of this could work. I mean, a lot of hubris, a lot of all of that going on. But again, you can't put something there if you don't have anything. Yeah, Malta is interesting because it took precedence. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's Yeah, like Malta's more important, right? Protecting Suez, Egypt, being that outpost, particularly for convoys to get through, and that air defense is massive for Malta. It's also closer. That's a thing that I like to repeat. I probably will never stop repeating it. Is why the Pacific is so difficult to fight in is because the distances are massive. Like they are massive. Like it's mind-bogglingly massive in a lot of ways. Like you can understand it, you can see it on a map, you can measure the distances. It's so huge. Like I went to Hawaii. Luckily, I am very lucky to go to Hawaii for my honeymoon back in April, and flying to Hawaii from we flew out of Toronto, it takes forever. You know, that's not even halfway from say the west coast of North America to East Asia. Like it's not even close to halfway, and it takes forever. So imagine trying to do anything else, trying to get those resources out there. Also, while you're fighting a war in Europe, like it's just a recipe for disaster. I don't think it would have mattered what they were trying to do. There's just too much going on. Britain's stretched to thin already by Dunkirk. They're already stretched thin. And they tried to do everything and anything they could to try and stop this. It just doesn't happen. So it's quite different. I wouldn't say I don't think they're apples and apples here. Malta's not the same, say, as a Singapore or a Hong Kong. Malta has a different role in pre-war. Hong Kong, I would say, was more important pre-war in terms of its commercial base. It was far more important for that. It's just like there's nothing they can do. There's nothing you can do for that, and it's just so different, right? And because they're fighting that land war in North Africa, then Malta's importance becomes huge, right? And they're sending convoys that some of them go horrible. It's a big part of that. Yeah. So it's interesting to understand, right? How can, and this, I've seen the debates, I've seen the discussions that went back and forth of like, what role could Hong Kong play in, say, a war with Japan? Right? Say they don't even attack it. Right? Like, what can it do? Should we even abandon, like, should we abandon it in that case too? Right? Like that's discussed at length. Regardless, even if they don't attack, should we just abandon it anyway? Does it have a role to play? Can we use it as a forward outpost? Some said yes, some said no, depending on how we want to fight this war. Sorry, I'm just reading quickly. Yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted to bring up here is, yeah, I mean, there should have been naval squadrons. I agree with you, but there's no money. There's no will. There's nothing to make that happen. They wanted, and why I think this is connecting to Hong Kong in my brain is because they wanted to do a seaplane base at Hong Kong. Literally, were planning for it. Had Hong Kong not have fallen, or they planned all of this, right, to use it as an OP or whatever. It just never went ahead because they didn't have time. They didn't have the resources. I mean, I'm talking like Hong Kong was stretched thin, right? It's this lavish place even at the time, but the military assets are minimal at best, and that's just on the ground. So you want to put destroyers and cruisers or whatever, squadrons, seaplanes, submarines. We're talking making a submarine base as well. Obviously, it didn't happen. How, right? When you have half the military who's in charge saying no, let alone the government saying no, what can you do, right? It's just, yeah, we obviously engaging in hindsight's fun in a lot of ways, but it's just, they were just so outstripped and just stretched so thin, and they wanted to talk to the Americans about getting their help. The Americans obviously said no. That was the whole idea, and then of course Pearl gets taken out momentarily, or temporarily. Sorry. So that adds another level to this. Even if the will of the Americans had been there, could they have done it anyway? Probably not. It's just so much going on here. It's crazy. But yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, better than nothing, depending on the numbers. I mean, right, there was planes in Hong Kong. They're just destroyed on the ground. It didn't do literally any good. They literally are destroyed instantly. It's the first attack is on the airfield at Kai Tak Airport, Air Base, the old airport there in Hong Kong still, before they built the new one. They're taken out completely, and then the RAF personnel fight as infantry. They actually fought with the Canadians for a short period. There's some questions of drunkenness connected to that. Again, in the dissertation, if you want to read that. But it's fascinating stuff. Do you mean for the... Sorry, Andreas, do you mean I think to halt Australia was vital for winning the Pacific War? You mean for the Japanese, if they had cut off Australia? Is that what you mean? Because I think I agree with you. Using it as a base was massive, especially after the Philippines falls. If that's what you mean. And yes, Malta was vital in defeating Rommel. Yeah, taking out his supply lines are massive. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading. I think to halt... Oh, sorry, one second. Bouncing all over the place here. I think to halt Australia, you mean to like defend, you mean? Yeah, I mean, yeah, Scott says it here. They start to reinforce it right away. That's where MacArthur goes, right? He runs his war out of Australia. That's where the Marines set up as well. Famously covered in the Pacific TV show and the books. Yeah, it's massive. I mean, again, as I always do, there's a Canadian connection because there always is. The Australians wanted Canadians in Australia. But after Hong Kong, of course, right, things are awkward, to say the least. You say no, and it caused a bit of a rift, which you wouldn't think about, Australian-Canadian diplomatic rift. Not many of those, but that caused one. They weren't happy. They just wanted a token force to say, like, hey, you're supporting us. The King government said no. Advisors, technical advisors, mostly radar and radio come later. But they wanted, at the beginning, they wanted Canadians there just to be like, hey, we're going to defend you in case the Japanese do land, which of course they never did. I mean, Darwin's bombed, but that's it. I mean, it wasn't going to happen in that sense anyway, as we know. But again, that's hindsight. They don't know that at the time. Yeah, I mean, conquest of Australia, there was, again, fears there as well that they were going to be attacked. And they were, like I said, Darwin's bombed. But like a full-out invasion was very unlikely. Excuse me, like it just would have the distances again. I mean, they tried, right? That was the whole New Guinea campaign, the Dakota Trail, all of that is to prevent the Japanese from taking Port Moresby and setting up and attacking northern Australian coasts. Yeah, I mean, that happens a lot. A whole debate about this, what's going on in the desert, Western Desert, and with Singapore itself, right? They wanted, again, public pressure in Australia wanted state troops in Singapore instead of in the Western Desert because it's closer to home, right? You can fight them there, which, as it turns out, was an utter disaster. Right, they're getting, was it the 8th Division get sent there late and wiped out more or less because of the disaster that fell Singapore, which is a whole other mess of a campaign. Big mess. I mean, it's massive. It's the same sort of idea. It's crazy. Yeah, a lot of Japanese air attacks. I mean, obviously they'll tail off after a while because they get pushed back, particularly in New Guinea. I mean, they're in Rabaul the whole war, kind of withering on the vine, as they called it. But they do slow down. But yeah, they did do some damage. Yeah, and you're right, Andreas. There's quite a bit of tension with Britain, Australia. I mean, there's tension throughout the Commonwealth. Like I said, right? There's Canadian-Australian tension. British-Canadian, Australian-British, New Zealand-British. Even, the British Raj has fights with, the India office. Like this goes on in war, particularly in the framework that was the British Empire and Commonwealth at the time. It just lended itself to conflict and difficulty in communication, right? That's why the whole Hong Kong thing is subjected to so much conspiracy theories and myths, is because the communication was poor. That allows, any sort of person to come up with anything. Because communication is terrible, they can be like, well, they did this because they did this. And there's nothing to disprove that, in that sense, because there's just no talking going on. Or there was somewhat of a cover-up, I argue, with Canada and Hong Kong. Yeah, that's in the dissertation. Very minor one, but more for domestic reasons, but for domestic political reasons. But yeah, it's going on. So yeah. You're right. They've been rocky. We had different opinions on a lot of things, particularly in the 1960s with Southeast Asia supporting the United States in that adventure. That's part of it. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's been looked at, not as much because I tried to understand this, right? Like, did that play into Hong Kong? Did that have an effect afterwards? Obviously, it did because they didn't want to send Canadians there until much later. But yeah, it's really, really an interesting thing. Yeah, I don't know if I missed any questions. Yeah, if you guys have questions, please fire away. Any way, shape, or form. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, going back to this about magic. Yeah, it was the purple diplomatic code that was magic. I don't know if they applied the name to the whole program. I don't remember. Maybe it was just like an after the fact kind of labeling sort of thing by historians. But yeah, JN25. Yeah, I think it might. I think you're right, Scott. I think it had a different name, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, that was huge. Obviously, breaking those codes, the diplomatic codes, especially. They've been reading again their messages since Versailles, which to me, I didn't learn that until a few years ago. It was crazy, like how long it had been going on. Technically allies, and they're spying on each other. It's fascinating stuff. Oh yeah, now we're busting it wide open. Yeah, maybe we can do more in East Asia generally. No, none whatsoever in terms of fighting in Canadian uniforms. No, no Canadian involvement in that one. Officially, Canadians fought in Vietnam under the American flag. A huge number. I think it's 50,000. They estimate Canadians, like Canadian-born Canadian citizens, fought in American uniforms during the Vietnam War. Some of them had no choice. Some were drafted. I've read stories of some who were actually conscripted because they had dual nationality or they lived in the United States at the time. Others crossed the border, lied about where they lived, and joined up. A lot of them. I did a show with a long time ago now on the channel about this, about Canada and the Vietnam War generally. I mean, Canada supplies all kinds of arms to the United States during the conflict, producing a lot of them, particularly the nastier ones that are synonymous with Vietnam, napalm and such, Agent Orange, those kinds of things. A lot of that going on. But no official Canadian involvement in the fighting. Canadians are sent as a peacekeeping force that doesn't work, obviously. They're there to try and, broker that peace that doesn't last. Them, Poland and India, I believe. It just doesn't happen. But no, in terms of actual fighting, no. The Americans wanted Canadians to help. There's quite the famous story of President Johnson, picking up Prime Minister Lester Pearson, and literally picking him up because Johnson was a large man. Pearson was not. Pearson was an athletic man, but he was not a big man. Picks him up and shakes him and yells at him for not, helping. It's crazy, these things, right? And how, how these things interact and what that did, right? And how this all impacts each other. It's crazy. And because Pearson also gave a speech basically denouncing the war in Vietnam indirectly, and that caused all kinds of rifts. But yeah. Yeah, roughly. I think there was more draft dodgers that went north than came south, to sign up, as far as I know. But it was a lot. I've seen 75,000, 100,000. It was a lot. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, here it is. That's the quote from Johnson. You pissed on my rug. Very Johnson statement to say. That's why I think it's so believable, and I think it actually happened because of that quote is something Johnson probably said more than once. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, back to the sort of draft dodgers that interchange. It's fascinating because a lot of they get pardoned, right? The draft dodgers, as they're called, after the war. So a lot of them go back. Good number stayed. A lot stayed actually, and became like I think William Gibson was one of them. He wrote what's that book called? Cyberpunk. They started that cyberpunk movement. I read it in undergrad. I can't remember what it is. Anyway, he was a draft dodger. A whole bunch of them in academics sticked around. I remember reading years ago there was an American. He was a draft dodger. He was a professor at U of T. Hadn't been to the United States in years and years and years and years and years. Still held his citizenship. They pinged him at the border because he hadn't paid income taxes in decades because he lived in Canada and was at U of T. He owed like hundreds of thousands in back taxes. I don't know how it resolved, but I just thought that was so interesting that how much these things can impact in decades later. But yeah. I mean, the numbers, I don't think there's like a specific number. They're all estimates, right? And, like how long did they stay and where did they go? Like a lot of them went back right away, right? Or some went back before the war even ended because they just, what's the point? It's really fascinating. But again, I don't know the numbers for sure. I'm sure there's lots of estimates. But it's not like someone's counting at the border. Are you dodging the draft? That's not going to be something that's asked. That's not going to be asked at the border crossing. The Ambassador Bridge in Windsor and Detroit. Are you dodging the draft? But you know what I mean. So I don't know. It's really interesting. Sorry, we're just kind of riffing here now, but yeah, that's funny. Yeah, because nobody knew about Ultra back then. It doesn't come till the 70s. They just kind of knew. Well, right? They tried to cover it up. Like a plane would show up all of a sudden, and then all of a sudden they're attacked. Yeah, it's crazy that such an incomplete part of the war and the historiography for decades was unknown. It's just madness. Yes, one American did claim that. I'm not saying his name. Yeah, some of them went to Mexico. A lot of them came to Canada. A lot. Because the Canadians weren't doing anything about it. They weren't sending anybody back, as far as I know, unless they explicitly broke the law in Canada, were caught. I don't think they sent anybody back. It was really prickly part of Canadian-American relations, right? And Carter cleans that up with the pardon and kind of just goes away. But I mean, that talk I did with John Boyko, sorry. You want to check that out afterwards about Canada and how it connects to Vietnam, generally speaking, in all kinds of ways. And that's one of them. Like a lot of them make a huge impact on Canada and what they were able and still living here. A lot of them are still living here. It's a huge number. But yeah, I mean, I agree. It's people have their reasons to avoid war. It's not always, some sort of stereotypical hippie or something, right? Same happens in Canada. Both world wars, there's a reason to avoid conscription for all kinds of reasons. Some are legitimate, some of them are not. I understand that. A lot more legitimate than people think, and for all kinds of reasons. And we just kind of sweep that under the rug. But yeah. Didn't expect Vietnam to come up, but I guess I should have. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything else. Yeah, going back to Australia here, Curtin was a prickly individual. That's one way to put it. Not well liked by any other world leader. Yeah, they were not a fan of him. Yeah, so unless you guys got anything else, just I'll give it a few minutes. You guys want more questions, I'm happy to stick around. I got nowhere to be. Really enjoyed this one. Love chatting. I'm glad it feels good to be back doing a live stream again, hanging out with everybody again. I have missed this. So thank you all for hanging out. I really appreciate it. Means a lot to have support from everybody and have people watching and hanging out and adding to my knowledge and giving questions and insights. It means a lot. So thank you. He was prime minister in Australia during the war. Yeah, he was not a liked individual. Again, I'm not an Australian expert, but he was one of the PMs. I'm going to go through, see if I missed anything. Yeah, and Miss from Colin, if he's still watching. Yeah, I mean, kind of going back to the distance thing and geography. It dictates everything in all war. but the Pacific especially, because again, the distances, the conditions, it's crazy what it takes to fight that war. It's still just mind-boggling with the technology, especially at the time, how they were able to do it and relatively quickly. It's just mind-boggling to think about, right? From being surprise attack at your main base to dropping 2 atomic bombs on the same country 4 years later. It's just mind-boggling how fast these things went. Okay, yeah, so I don't think that's it. Yeah, so thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Like I said earlier, if you can become a patron, that's awesome. I do need more patrons to kind of keep things running. Just been struggling a little bit with that and keeping everything going. Again, having some questions about what that's going to mean. I have to take some time in the new year to think about what OTD might look like moving forward. There might be some changes. I might have to. I might not have a choice. Because it's just the money situation sucks for me, unfortunately. But yeah, so thank you again all for the patrons who watch and support me and messages and everything, especially with the passing of the family member. It was nice to have that community. Something that means a lot to me. So thank you, everyone. It's great. So so thank you, everyone. And coming forward, actually, yeah, great to meet you. Good question. Actually, I can talk about that for a second if you guys want to bear with me. So I want to. Okay, how do I say this? I'm working on contracts right now. That's basically how I keep paying my bills. I try not to talk about it too much just because it's kind of relevant to my work. It's a little different. And sometimes I find cool stuff. That's when I tweet it out or put it on YouTube because I'm just finding it other places, and which is cool that way. I'm not like on any no disclosures or anything like that. Just you guys might find it boring. Anyway, so I've got I'm on a big one right now, like time wise. That's going through the new year. So I wanted to do Veritable, Operation Veritable, Rhineland more generally. I wanted to do it like at the launch of Veritable, so that early week in February, right? Because it starts on the 8th, because it brings in Americans, Brits, Canadians, all kinds of different weapons and ways of going about learning of the war and, the repercussions from Market Garden and the Sheld and everything. So maybe it might not be like at the time of Veritable, but if you guys are interested in that, please do let me know. That would be awesome to have some feedback on that because I know some people are interested in it. Get some guests together. I've got a couple of people who said they would, so we'll see how that goes. Excuse me, it's just going to be a timing thing because for those of you who don't know, the Canadian government's fiscal calendar is March, so year end is March, so that's why these things go over. Yeah. Okay. Well, Colin's on board. Awesome. Yeah, I want to do it. I will. I don't know what it's going to look like yet. It might just be 1 or 2 people. It might not be like a week, like I did with kind of for Normandy or for the Shell. It might not be as much as that. As much as I'd love to do that, I just might not have the time because, like, I like to get Europeans on here because I do during the day. But I like the archives were weird with their hours still. So I don't know. I'll talk to some people. But again, like I already said earlier, I got to do some thinking what OTD might look like moving forward. It's a lot for me to run by myself. And like I said, it's not the most lucrative thing in the world. And it's causing some issues for me. So I need to keep that in mind moving forward. And again, we had some rough times with the family member passing away and just having really this existential dread on whenever I sent that message out. And I got lots of great support, which did mean the world to me. It really did mean the world to me. So thank you for all of that. And I will be sure to let people know what's going on. I'm not going to shut anything down. I don't know if it'll be as much involved as it has been. I don't know. I have to sit and think about it. Lots of thinking to do over the break. I'm going to try and take a week off from everything. I might not do anything in that week. I might just stop everything. I don't know. I have to think. I got lots of thinking to do. That's why I'm home alone this weekend to get some work done and do some thinking. So other than that, yeah, thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for all the support. Those who are team members on the YouTube channel and through Patreon, thank you. again, you guys are awesome. Come out to all my chats and everything. We'll get some more going. I'm going to have one on Ortona coming up. I'll get the details out later, maybe by the end of this weekend. Again, just lots for me to manage by myself. But I will do what I can, and I will keep you guys informed as much as possible, but I don't know myself. So again, thank you. And I'm glad to see people are excited to see something about Veritable and the Rhineland coming up. So I will see what I can do with that. So other than that, thanks everyone. Have a good weekend. And there might be a video coming up by the end of the weekend. We'll see how fast I can get it out. But I'm trying to do a really good job with it and not rush it. So keep an eye out for that. And really do check out that Pearl Harbor video. I mean, the footage to me is just awesomely striking and so interesting. So check that out when we're done here. If you could, that'd be great. And have a good day, everybody. See you next time.